Welcome to the Nicholas 11x12 technology. Today we're looking at the GIGABYTE GeForce GTX 760 2GB GDDR5 NVIDIA graphics card. The GTX 760 is meant to replace the older GTX 660 Ti card while still maintaining the same price point. Before I move on, I'd like to thank Fortacus, an amazing computer store and online shop, for providing me this product. The box, here it is now. Once again, we're looking at the GIGABYTE GeForce GTX 760 graphics card with 2GB of GDDR5 video memory. This is an OC version card. This means GIGABYTE factory overclocked it. The clock speed of the reference model is 980 MHz, but this GIGABYTE version is clocked at 1085 MHz. The boost clock is also higher, 1033 MHz on the reference design and 1150 MHz on this specific card. However, GIGABYTE decided not to overclock the memory. This GTX 760 is using the famous GIGABYTE WindForce cooler featuring 3 fans. And here's additional marketing for GIGABYTE's OC Guru 2 GPU monitoring and overclocking tool. On the side are some basic specifications such as the amount and type of memory again, the bus width, DirectX version, PCIe 3.0 and so on. Now on the back of the box, GIGABYTE basically lets you know how exactly their WindForce cooler works and does its job. But now let's open this box up and see what's inside. Inside is another box, a very nice black one with a GIGABYTE logo on top. Inside of this box you see the graphics card sits right on top, well protected in an anti-static bag. We'll take a closer look at the card a little bit later. First, we'll move on to the accessories. Here we have 2 power adapters in case you have an older power supply, a dual Molex to PCIe 6-pin and a dual Molex to PCIe 8-pin power adapter. As always, the GIGABYTE quick installation guide for people that don't know how to install graphics cards yet. Of course, a driver CD is also included, but I'd really recommend downloading the latest drivers from NVIDIA's website. Now that we are done with the accessories, let's move on to the graphics card. It's inside this anti-static bag. I'll take it out so we can take a closer look at it. But before I go into detail, I'll remove all the plastic protection pieces first. Here it is now, the GIGABYTE GTX 760. Like I've said before, the WindForce cooler is used. Unfortunately, GIGABYTE didn't use their newer WindForce version with the black metal shroud. This is the WindForce revision 1.0, the newer one is revision 2.0, and GIGABYTE actually has a GTX 760 featuring the new cooler and a nice black PCB. But I have this version, which is also very beautiful. As you can see, a shiny black plastic shroud sits right on top of the aluminum heatsinks. Up here you can again see that the WindForce cooler is used here, and the special thing with the WindForce cooler is the 3 fans that blow air onto the massive amount of aluminum that sits right on top of the chips. All the heatsinks are connected with 3 copper heat pipes, which I hope you can see here. Here on the rear of the card you can see the ends of the heat pipes. This is how the card will be installed in your system, and it'll look like that. I personally really like the metal stabilization here, and there's even a nice GIGABYTE logo on it. This metal piece will definitely add stability to the quite long and heavy card so it doesn't get bent that easy. To power that card up you will require a PCIe 8-pin and a PCIe 6-pin power connector. GIGABYTE obviously still uses their standard blue PCB, but again, I really would like to see a black one. But I guess we're looking at the wrong model then, because this is revision 1.0. The PCI Express 3.0 interface is used, but you can still install this card into older PCIe 2.0 slots with minimal performance differences. Up here are 2 SLI connectors, allowing you to run a 3-way SLI configuration. In case you didn't already notice it, this is a dual slot card, and as for the outputs, there's one DVI out at the top, another DVI out below, one HDMI out, and last but not least, one DisplayPort output. Up here are some ventilation holes. This is a quite long card actually, and it definitely will not fit into everyone's case, so make sure you have enough space in your case. Also, the card is quite heavy, but that's okay because I like heavier cards. Overall, I really like how this GTX 760 looks like. Aesthetics, however, are always a thing of taste. Some like it a lot and some don't. So in terms of the design, I have no complaints. It looks beautiful. But now let's move on to the specifications. The GIGABYTE GeForce GTX 760 has 2GB of GDDR5 memory. The same old GK104 GPU is used, like on the older GTX 680, 670 and 660 Ti cards. This graphics card has a core clock of 1085 MHz and a boost clock of 1150 MHz, but in reality, this specific card will go even higher on the boost clock. The memory clock is at 1502 MHz. As for the TDP, it's 170 watts, and the same old 28nm architecture is still used. DirectX 11.1 is supported with a feature level of DX 11.0. This graphics card also comes with a 256-bit bus width. In GPU-C you can see all the specs again. Like I've said before, the GTX 760 uses the same old GK104 GPU, but this doesn't necessarily mean that the same performance is offered. For instance, the GTX 680, 670 and 660 Ti cards all use the GK104 GPU. However, there was a big performance difference between these cards. All NVIDIA basically does here is improve their GK104 graphics cards and sell it under a different naming scheme and price. This GTX 760 should replace the 660 Ti and also offer more performance for a similar price of the older GTX 660 Ti. Of course, at the time of this video, I used the latest drivers. As for the clock speeds, GIGABYTE really pushed this GTX 760 really far with these really high clock speeds compared to the reference designed by NVIDIA. But because GIGABYTE factory overclocked this card so far, you will pretty much not be able to overclock it much anymore, so that you can benefit from it in terms of some extra frame rates. GIGABYTE actually did the job for you already. But now let's move on to the benchmarks and see what this graphics card really can do. So there you have it. The GIGABYTE GeForce GTX 760 2GB GDDR5 definitely is not a bad graphics card at all. It was meant to replace the older GTX 660 Ti, and it really does. because right now, at the time of this video, the older GTX 660 Ti costs about the same as this newer GTX 760. So what makes this card attractive for the consumer? Well, the same price alone doesn't really make a change, but this GTX 760 beats the older GTX 660 Ti by far. The performance pretty much is not comparable anymore, but the price is, and that's a really good thing for the consumer. For the price of the GTX 660 Ti, you pretty much get a little less performance than the GTX 670. Although technology didn't really improve, the naming scheme together with the pricing improved. It is an improvement, not a major technical one, but the pricing is fantastic. Depending on the game, you will be able to play almost any game at maxed out settings at the 1080p resolution. Unfortunately, AMD didn't yet release the new graphics card series, and so it's a little hard to compare this card with the competition. But when I compare the so-called new technology from NVIDIA with the older technology from AMD, this GTX 760 could probably be compared with the HD 7950 card. But then again, that's a little unfair because we have to compare 2013 technology with 2013 technology. The temperatures are no problem at all, even with 69 degrees Celsius at full load. I left everything at the default settings. I just installed the graphics card into my system and installed the driver, that's it. But if you want to, with Gigabyte's Osiguru 2, or what I prefer even more, the EVGA Precision X GPU monitoring and overclocking tool, you could set up custom fan curves or just manually let the fans spin at higher RPM values. This would lower the temperatures even more. However, I wouldn't change anything here in terms of temperatures, since everything is okay. The power consumption, however, looks really bad on this GTX 760. With the same system, the HD 7970 GHz edition graphics card consumes as much power as the a lot weaker GTX 760. That isn't good at all. The power consumption can no longer be compared against the one of the replaced GTX 660 Ti. However, more performance is offered, so you might as well not compare it with that card at all. But what I've noticed is that Gigabyte says the boost clock would be at 1150 MHz. In reality, it goes all the way up to 1215 MHz. With the EVGA Precision X tool, I lowered the power and temperature targets so that on full load the GPU will run at the listed 1150 MHz and not 1215 MHz. This lowered the power consumption a lot. However, the weird thing is the performance didn't decrease. I'm not sure why the boost clock exceeds the listed one. Is it Gigabyte's fault or NVIDIA's? I don't know. But when buying this Gigabyte GTX 760, I'd really recommend getting the Osiguru 2 or EVGA Precision X GPU tools and lower the power and temp targets to these settings. Power target 74% and temp target 70 degrees. This will make the GPU run at 1149 to 1150 MHz at load. However, in most games that also won't be much of a help because it'll simply ramp up to 1250 MHz. Power consumption is a very important thing in my opinion. I know many will not agree with me, but others definitely will. You don't have to do that, but it's my free advice for you out there that care about the power consumption. Because Gigabyte already factory overclocked this graphics card so far, there's pretty much no overclocking headroom anymore. Of course you will be able to squeeze out just a tiny little bit more performance, but in my opinion it's really not worth the hassle. The WindForce cooler does an excellent job at cooling this card down. I know you might say 69 degrees Celsius aren't that excellent, but the fans were spinning at fairly low RPM values and so the card was very silent even on full load. This Gigabyte GTX 760 also looks very beautiful, although the Revision 2.0 model looks even nicer with the black PCB and the metal shroud. Just be careful with computer cases. I wanted to install this card into my Intel i7 3770K system with the Cooler Master Storm Scout mid-tower case, but unfortunately my case didn't have enough space for such a long graphics card. So overall an improvement is noticeable, especially when looking at the price-performance ratio. The only real big thing that bothers me is the power consumption. However, sometime in the future, NVIDIA could also come up with new drivers that fix the boost clock issue and the higher power consumption. Now, is it worth it, let's say, to upgrade from the GTX 660 Ti to the GTX 760 for the same price? In terms of performance, it definitely is. Everything with this GTX 760 will run a lot better than with the GTX 660 Ti. So in the end, this GTX 760 can be considered as a good purchase. Pros are very good price-performance ratio, the card offers great performance, it's very silent and has a great and durable design. For the cons, I can only say it has a high power consumption. However, like I've said before, you can manually lower the power and temp targets to lower the power consumption. I give this GIGABYTE GTX 760 graphics card an 8 out of 10 and would definitely recommend it. Once again, thanks to Forticus for providing me this graphics card. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and visit nicholas11x5techx.com to see videos there earlier than on YouTube.